Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Steve Taylor. Really looking forward to this, Steve. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Simon. Great to be with you.
Yeah. So, Steve, unusually, we've got a non-adoptee here, right, listeners? But I heard Steve on another podcast, and he has a really refreshing take on post-traumatic growth. So we talked before on the podcast about post-traumatic growth. My hope for today is that we're going to bring that alive for you, dear listeners, talking about one of Steve's take on post-traumatic growth, and that is something called transformation through turmoil. And Steve is a senior lecturer in psychology and spirituality at Leeds Beckett University, which is just 14 miles or so from where I live. And I joke to some people that we've had more people on the podcast from Hawaii and New Zealand than we've had from Yorkshire. But Steve's actually originally from Lancashire. You still live in Lancashire, but you work out.
I do, yeah. I commute to Yorkshire across the border. To work.
Yeah. There's a bit of rivalry between Leeds, between Leeds and Bradford, between Leeds and Manchester in the football, definitely in the football, but also between Yorkshire and Lancashire. So yeah, there can be the War of the Roses. It can get a bit tribal, can't it, Steve?
It can, especially in sport. You know, I live close to the cricket ground here in Manchester. And when Lancashire play Yorkshire, it goes crazy. It turns into a football match with sort of hooliganism and drunkenness and everything. So
yeah. Wow. So in soccer at the moment, Leeds have just been relegated to the Championship, which is the second level, and that's a long time since that happened to Manchester United or City, right? You're clearly riding high on football.
Yeah, that's true. Although I can remember as a kid when Man United were in the second division back in the 1970s. So yeah, but that seems like it's a long time ago now. 45 years ago, I think.
Yeah. Wow. So he's a senior lecturer. He's an author. He's also a poet as well. So what is this transformation through turmoil, Steve? What do you see as that?
It's a phenomenon I became aware of when I wasn't specifically researching it. I was researching spirituality, which is my area of psychology. I do research into spiritual experiences, not in the religious, not necessarily in the religious connection, but just transformational experiences when people undergo a shift in consciousness and perceive a different reality. The world seems like a different place for a few moments, could be just for a few seconds, maybe a few minutes. They seem to glimpse a higher reality, a more intense reality, and have a sense of meaning, maybe a sense of harmony. And these experiences have very powerful after effects, so that people feel a new sense of purpose, a new sense of meaning. And I was doing research into the causes of these experiences. Sometimes they're caused by contact with nature, when you're walking in a beautiful landscape in the hills or by the coast and you feel inspired by the beautiful scenery. Sometimes they happen after, a meditation or after a period of relaxation. But I found out that the most frequent trigger of these uplifting, awakening experiences was intense psychological turmoil. So they often occurred following periods of depression, addiction, intense stress, and a wide variety of negative experiences. So that just led me to investigate the transformational effects of psychological turmoil in more detail.
Yeah. So what came to my mind as you were talking there, Steve, was the fact that I had a little one of these, right? A little transformational experiences, probably about 15 years ago. And the reason why it comes to mind is because, on your website, and there's links in the show notes, as always, listeners, there's a link to a video of you and Eckhart Tolle, right? And I read his book, The Power of Now, for about 15 years or so ago on holiday. And the following day, I had this shift in consciousness. So what actually happened? We were in Turkey, and it was August, and the ground is parched and really dry yellow, and it actually shifted from yellow to brown, and the sea went from like a mid blue to a really intense, powerful, almost black blue. The world slowed down, so everything went really quiet, and as it went really quiet, I could hear the wind whistling through the thatched cottage, the straw on the top of this beach bar that we were sitting in. And I don't know how long that lasted, but it came, when I came back to normal, a normal level of consciousness, I said to my wife, "Why do we only come here for 2 weeks?" So I was kind of apportioning. I was putting the shift in my consciousness down to the place. But looking back on it now, I can see that it was the Eckhart Tolle book that I'd read the day before. Something had shifted for me. So there is a shift. There is a shift in our consciousness, and then it goes to a profound pace, and then there is a residual, like there's a residual kind of left on the back of that, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It probably wasn't a coincidence that you were on holiday because, as I said before, that these experiences do happen when we are in a mood of relaxation. Relaxation sort of opens us to these experiences. And then maybe there's another kind of stimulus like reading the book and the power of the book. That, funny enough, a lot of people have written to me saying that they've had similar experiences while reading that book. It seems to have quite an uncanny power to bring about those experiences.
And it's quite. He speaks. I think, is he German originally? I can't.
Originally, yeah.
And his sentences are quite long, so you kind of for me, I really have to concentrate on it. So when I was talking to somebody about it this morning, and he says for him it's so the pace is so gentle. It slows him down, so sometimes he actually falls asleep if he's listening to the guy. I think the fascinating thing for me is that you're looking at both these things as you're looking at spirituality and psychology, and for me the spirituality place is the place where I have found more peace. Because for me, spirituality is about who we are, and psychology is about how we think and how we feel. So we're kind of going upstream. I talk about going upstream from how we feel and how we think to who we are. How do you see? What's your take on all that stuff?
Well, I agree with you. I think psychology, in its conventional sense, is quite limited. It just does deal with the mind, and also mainstream psychology is quite reductionist. It sometimes portrays human beings as chemical machines, and everything we do is a product of neurological functioning, or our thoughts are just chemicals in the brain. So that can be quite limiting as well. But I actually work in an area called transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal as in beyond the ego or beyond the self. And that has a much more kind of holistic picture of a holistic view of human nature. So it doesn't just deal with mind, the functioning of the brain. It kind of opens up into areas such as spirituality. So transpersonal psychology tries to link psychology to spirituality, so and it encompasses both.
Right. So as we spoke last time, and I was sharing you this theory of the primal wound, and one of a theory that came from an adoptive mum in the US is that she's a doctor and a GP, and I think she went on to do to become study psychology as well as body health, shall we call it? So she came up with this idea that there's a primal wound, this theory really struck me as I read the book, and I thought, well, this is she's saying many things that I think of, ring a chord with me, such as like a feeling of lower self-esteem, a desire to want to control things, an insecurity in this place, and then, but somewhere along the line, I got to this place where I thought, well, what is actually wounded? And I definitely felt wounded, right? But we're not our feelings. So what has been wounded? I thought, well, maybe my sense of self has been wounded, and so I thought, yeah, I definitely feel that too. But then from my sense of myself, I thought, well, is my sense of self actually myself? And somehow I got to draw a distinction, because I thought maybe sense of self seems more like ego to me.
I think it is. Yeah. I think, in spirituality, a lot of different traditions and teachers make a distinction between the ego, which is a kind of constructed self. It consists of concepts, and it's maintained by thinking, and it's constructed by our societies through expectations and conventions. But there's another self which stands beyond that and which can observe that. You mentioned Eckhart Tolle, and his awakening occurred when he realized that he was another self. There was another part of him which was able to watch his own psychological suffering and stand back from it. Then he realized that he was not the thinking self. He was not the self which was full of anxiety and which was in pain and which identified with his suffering. He was the self which observed that. And then as soon as he realized that, then his ego self dissolved away, and he became identified with this deeper self.
Yeah.
So sorry, yeah. So I would say the primal wound occurs to that constructed self, or maybe it is built into that constructed self because it's a separate self. It's not the authentic self.
Yeah. So we're talking a lot of concepts here. So let me try. I came up with a metaphor for this, Steve, which for me makes it really, really simple. And it came to me last year some point. I thought, because I'm a keen swimmer. So I was thinking about, I was thinking about this in the swimming pool, and somebody was in front of me, and she was creating quite a lot of waves, right? And I was behind her, and I was trying to go past her. My body was being rocked in the water by these waves coming off this other swimmer, right? So my body could feel that disturbance in the water, right? So that's my one that's one way of looking at our identity, is our body. And then what was actually going on in my head, or maybe my ego, is, why is this woman in my way? Right. So that's the ego. Why couldn't she go swimming at a different time? And all sorts of really stupid kind of thoughts coming out of off the back of my ego. And then there was another part of me that was totally aware of all this ranting that was going on in my ego, and aware of the thing in the ruffling of the body, but totally detached from it, like it was the lifeguard up a little ladder, in a chair, so that they can look across the swimming pool and see if anybody's see if anybody's in trouble. So that's the metaphor. That's kind of my metaphor for the higher self. And I know you've done in some of your books, you've looked at the kind of near-death experiences, and that's that observer self. A lot of people talk about, if they're in a hospital, the body is on the gurney, on the bed, and they're looking. Yeah, can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. Near-death experiences occur when people clinically die for a short time, when their blood flow ceases, and no oxygen going up to the brain. They cease breathing, and even though they physically seem to be unconscious, they inwardly they often find themselves looking down on the scene from above. They seem to leave their bodies and have an out-of-body experience, and they normally feel a powerful sense of serenity and peace. And a lot of people are actually reluctant to go back into the bodies because they feel so serene.
Yeah,
And there are all kinds of other phenomena that occur later. It's kind of like a sequential experience. And the first stage is that out of body experience. And so often when they return to their bodies, they're able to report what was going on. They sometimes report details of operations. A friend of mine had one experience, an out of body experience during an operation, and he heard music playing in the operating theatre, which he thought he recognised. He thought it was Mozart, and so when he came to in recovery, he said to the anaesthetist or to the doctor, I'm not sure who it was. He said, "Oh, was that Mozart you were playing in the operating theatre?" And they were totally shocked because there's no way he could have heard the music. And but those experiences are not uncommon.
yeah. So if we take this transformation through turmoil, if we take that first word of transformation, most of us see that word as change, but it's got a deeper. It's got has transformation got a deeper definition than change? Is it beyond form? Is that what it means?
Yeah, literally it means beyond form. Yeah, but
Yeah,
I mean, there are obviously different degrees of transformation, but transformation through turmoil is it's really a transformation into a different form. It's really a transformation into a different identity. It's a bit like a lot of people report it in terms of their old identity dissolves away, and they feel like they are a new person inhabiting the same body. So it's such a radical change that they do physically, psychologically feel like different people in the same body.
yeah. Now, I know that some of the work you've done some work in with in one of the books that you've written. You talk about an alcoholic. I think. Do you? Is that one of the?
Yeah, yeah. I have a chapter on the connection between transformation and addiction.
Yeah, because the incidence of alcoholism is elevated amongst adoptees compared to
Mm, mm.
compared to the general population. So, could you talk a little bit into that? What you found in this area?
I found when I was doing my research, I found many cases of transformation following or in the midst of alcoholism. So people who've been severe alcoholics for many years, to the point where they felt they'd lost everything over the course of their addiction. Everything had begun to fall away. They'd lost their friendships, they'd lost their family, they'd lost their jobs. Um, yeah, and eventually they hit the classic rock bottom when they were in a state of desolation. To give you a specific example, there was one woman I interviewed from Scotland. She was from Edinburgh, Scotland, and she was an alcoholic for over 20 years. And eventually, everything crumbled away over the course of her addiction. She was left homeless on the streets of Edinburgh, and she was just shoplifting to maintain her addiction, sleeping rough, and she was so physically broken down that she couldn't walk more than a few steps before she had to stop. And she tried to stop drinking before, but she couldn't do it. So she'd given up hope. Basically, she realized that she had no hope, and she decided to attempt suicide. But somehow, in the midst of her suicide attempt, she actually tried to throw herself in front of a coach that was traveling from Glasgow to Edinburgh. She just jumped out in front of it, but miraculously, the driver swerved and she survived. But somehow, in the midst of that process, she underwent a transformation, and she said that the police took her back to her parents' house, and her mum said to her, "Well, you're an alcoholic, so I'll have to give you a drink, won't I?" So her mum poured her a glass of wine, but she was physically unable to drink it. She tried to lift the wine, but another part of her put it down. She kept lifting up the glass and putting it down again. Then she looked at herself in the mirror, and she felt like she was looking at a different person. She didn't recognize her reflection. And then the doctor arrived and gave her some medication to deal with the withdrawal symptoms. But when she came to, she felt somehow free of her addiction. It just disappeared, and she felt like she was a different person with a new sense of connection to people, a new sense of empathy for people, a new sense of the kind of vividness of her surroundings, a new feeling of connection to nature. So everything shifted in those few moments. And I'm still in contact with her now, and she's been sober for 15 years now, and she's maintained this sense of well-being and this sense of connection, also a sense of appreciation, a new sense of the value of things in her life. And that's I call that release from craving, when people's addiction suddenly and apparently mysteriously disappears. And it's not uncommon.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's common, but it's, there are certainly, many cases where it occurs.
Yeah. So I'm getting a feeling that there's a scale, there's different sizes of transformational shift. So the reason that comes to mind is you use the word vivid, and that's how I knew that I was having my own little shift in Turkey 15 years ago, because the colours became more vivid. That would be a beautiful way. And so, and you said that the lady who almost died, she had her circumstances, her surroundings became more vivid. So there are different sizes of these transformational changes, and we're talking. Are we talking beyond? We're talking beyond form, aren't we? Are we talking about the shift between body or mind, or body mind to spirit, to consciousness, to awareness? Is that what we're talking about here?
You could explain it in those terms. It is almost as if it's a shift beyond ego. It is almost as if the normal ego that we were talking about earlier, the kind of socially constructed ego that consists of thoughts and concepts, it's almost as if that dies away, and it reveals itself as a kind of superficial, inauthentic self, and a much deeper self reveals itself as our true identity. And that spiritual self was always there, but it was just covered over by this ego identity. So it's a bit like, you could compare it to the transformation a caterpillar goes through from a chrysalis into a butterfly. Something that was always there, that was always latent anyway, it just emerges and takes the place of the old self. And so in that sense, you could call it a shift into a new spiritual self.
Yeah. It's powerful, and there's also a sense that it's something that's happened. It's something that happens to us, not something that we make happen.
Exactly, yeah. I guess it definitely unravels itself spontaneously. We can't consciously induce it. That's certainly true. But I think there are certain, there are certain sort of traits or certain attitudes which can allow it to manifest itself. It's a bit like post-traumatic growth, which you're familiar with. And post-traumatic growth happens to a lot of people, but it doesn't happen to everybody. And there are certain reasons why it doesn't happen to everybody, and why some people do experience it. People who are more kind of open and more willing to explore themselves, people who are more kind of trusting in their own experiences, they tend to experience more post-traumatic growth. But also, it's about acknowledgement and acceptance. You've got to be prepared to acknowledge that you're going through suffering. You've got to be prepared to look into your own psychological turmoil rather than diverting yourself from it. I guess that's one thing with addiction is all about diverting yourself from your own feelings. It's about escaping your inner turmoil. So if you continue to be an addict, you're not going to experience any transformation. You can only experience transformation when you stop diverting yourself, and you look inward and you explore and face your psychological turmoil. And there's a certain moment of acceptance when you look your predicament squarely in the face, and you drop your resistance to it. You say, okay, this is the way things are, I accept this situation as it is. This is my reality. Oh, it's a bit like surrender. You let go of resistance to the situation, and that's when transformation is more likely to occur.
Yeah, very powerful. And also very powerful, and a very kind of like a finite thing, a very specific thing, the thing that came to my mind is a lady who's in recovery now, like quite a well-known adoptee called Pamela Karanova. She came on the podcast, and she said basically essentially what you just said. She had been numbing. She felt that she was overwhelmed by her trauma. She feared those feelings, feared those overwhelming feelings, and so she numbed them. And when she stopped trying to numb them, that's when the shift happened for her, and that was the start of her. That was the start of that insight, that epiphany, that aha moment. That marked the start of her recovery journey.
Yeah, I found that in many of the cases I investigated, many of the cases of transformation through turmoil, people could actually identify the specific moment when they shifted into a mode of acceptance. And that was usually when the transformation occurred, as if the acceptance was the trigger for the transformation.
Yeah.
And in some addicts, it was related if they started to follow the 12-step program in AA or NA. It was the moment when they hand over their problem, when they admit that this problem is too big for them, and they just let go and hand it over to a higher power of some form. In some cases, that was when they experienced transformation.
Yeah.
But in other cases, it was just when they realized that they had to change, or they had to face a reality. But as you said before, in many cases, it was purely spontaneous. It seemed to happen for no particular reason.
One of the things I say on the podcast now and then is that these insight moments, these aha moments, we can't induce them. I love the word you said, the word induce. We can't induce them. We can't force them. We can't make them happen, but we can put ourselves in a good place to make them happen. And you said by being open. And the phrase I came up with a while ago, or maybe I came up with it, maybe I borrowed it off another mentor, is hanging out at the bus stop, for insights, right? And then I often, because if I was listening, I would want to know how. So at that point, I always I always say to listeners, that's what you're doing now. You are listening to Steve and Simon talking about this stuff, and by doing that, you are putting yourself in the path that hopefully some insights will happen. So you don't need to worry about how to do it, because you're already doing it, right?
Yeah, I like that. That's good. Yeah. There was somebody once said about meditation, about whether somebody once asked, if you meditate, can it bring about spiritual awakening? And the reply was, spiritual awakening is an accident, but meditation makes you more accident prone.
Accident prone, yeah.
Yes. Like so it is an accident, but you can sort of create the conditions which make it more likely to occur.
And talking about meditation, there's this guy I'm listening to a lot, and I know that you've listened to him, Rupert Spira. He says that meditation is what we are, not what we do.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
It's that. What he's talking about is to me, I think what he's talking about is that the piece of that essential self. It is naturally quieter, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, we get so used to being immersed in our thoughts. We can spend whole days being immersed in our thoughts without realizing, and we just accept that we think of it as natural. We just assume that that thought created identity is our
Yeah.
normal identity. So it takes a moment of not being immersed in thoughts to realize, that's not really me. There's something else underneath that. And often being immersed in thoughts causes suffering. That often that is the source of our suffering, especially when we dwell on, events from the past. We dwell on resentments from the past and hurts that we experienced in the past. So if you in meditation, you can step outside that stream of thoughts, and you can also free yourself from all the hurt and the suffering which comes with that stream of thoughts.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of minutes ago the word acceptance, and you've got a poem that talks about that. So maybe this is an opportune moment to share that poem with us. Do you want?
Great. Yeah, this is a poem I wrote called "The Alchemy of Acceptance." It's all about the transformational power which comes with the attitude of acceptance. The alchemy of acceptance. Emptiness can be a vacuum, cold and hostile, dark with danger. Or emptiness can be radiant space, gleaming with soft stillness. And the only difference between them is acceptance. A task may seem tedious, a chore to rush through reluctantly, or a task may seem rewarding, a process to relish with an attentive mind that reveals more richness the more present we become. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Pain may seem unbearable, searing through you from a sharp, concentrated point, so that you have no choice but to resist, to try to escape, to push away the pain. Or pain can be a sensation that you can move toward and merge with, that no longer has a center, that dissipates through your being, until it becomes soft and numb, no longer pain at all. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Trauma can break you down to nothing, destroy the identity you spent your whole life building up, like an earthquake that leaves you in ruins. Or trauma can transform you, break open new depths and heights of your being, give rise to a greater structure, a miraculous new self. And the only difference between them is acceptance. Life can be frustrating and full of obstacles, with desires for a different life disturbing your mind. Or life can be fulfilling, full of opportunities, with a constant flow of gratitude for the gifts you have. And the only difference between them is acceptance.
Wow. That's genius. That really is genius, mate.
Thanks.
Yeah. There's so much there. There's so much there, and there's so much that is adoptee relevant, adoptee specific. I'm actually a really, like you said, you're going to have a look at your poems and pick one or two, and that one is the point. One of them is the point and the searing blade, and I was thinking about the primal wound, and we're talking about that earlier on, and the trauma, and kind of like snuggling up to the trauma instead of pushing the trauma away. And that's what we're doing when we're numb, like bringing it in closer. Isn't that people say, I don't know, is that Don Corleone in The Godfather, keep your keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, or something like that. I can't,
Yeah, that's
bring
right.
your trauma in, bring the
Mm.
trauma in, like
Yeah,
snuggle up to it and befriend it,
yeah,
and love it. See it as a pointer, right?
yeah. And then you can, obviously that's difficult to do. It's very challenging. But if you can do it, with support and therapy, then you harness the transformational power of your trauma. Because your what seems to be your enemy is the source of incredible strength and resilience and power. It's the seed of a new life. If you can harness its
Yeah.
transformational potential.
I was I was thinking about triggers this morning. Like, so people say, "I get triggered." Something happened. I was triggered, and it's triggered. It's brought up some trauma back to the top. Something's come up to the surface again. And I've been triggered.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about triggers in, so what's the, if there was a positive take on triggers, what would it be, right? And so I was trying to think of this morning I was thinking of as many good words for triggers, what they do. So I thought of triggers as a gift, triggers as a blessing, triggers as a catalyst, catalyst to new growth, as a pointer to when our subconscious thoughts have gone awry, as a reminder of something that we've heard in the past, that that we want a better version of ourselves, a prompt, a suggestion, a present. So yeah, gift and present go together. And then I got another one which is a bit clumsy, but I put it as an epiphany causer. Epiphany causer. But that poem's just genius. Do you feel that it's coming through you? Is it?
Yeah, it's difficult to describe, but it definitely comes through me. There's some sort of guidance. Obviously I edit what comes through me, but essentially it comes through me, and usually in those quiet moments when my thought mind is quite slow and quiet, and there's a bit of space inside me. When I'm relaxed, or when I'm meditating, or I like running, swimming. They're sources of inspiration for me. So any moment really when my mind's fairly quiet and empty, that's when poems come through.
Yeah. And what, as you look back at that poem, and it's on your website, so we'll link to the poem on the website. Are there any things that seem particularly relevant for you, and in that, any particular lines that seem relevant to you in that poem, given what we've been talking about so far?
Well, I think partly that poem came from the witnessing the power of resistance, the negative power of resistance. I saw it in my father. My father had quite a traumatic upbringing. His mother committed suicide when he was just a child, and he always felt this sense of being abandoned. Probably not dissimilar to the sense of abandonment that some adoptees feel. And he had the trauma of her mental illness before she committed suicide, and there were kind of a couple of other traumatic incidents. So my father, he always faced life with this attitude of resistance. He never faced up to any difficulties. It was always he had problems with drink as well. But I mean, he did his best. He was a great guy. But his attitude was always one of resistance. So later in life, about 15 years ago, my mother became seriously ill, and my father carried on with his resistance. He could never face up to the reality of the situation that she was seriously ill. And it caused a lot of discord. And, eventually I managed to gently persuade him to face the reality of the situation. And towards the end of his life, he became more, calmer and had a more harmonious attitude to reality. So, in the same way that acceptance has this tremendous positive power, resistance has a tremendous negative power too. You more than anything else, resistance takes up so much energy. you can spend all your energy resisting the reality of your life, because resistance means erecting a barrier. You're constantly at war with reality. But so as soon as you switch into a mode of acceptance, that barrier fades away and all the energy that you use in resistance is returned to you. So you feel this tremendous sense of energetic well-being, as well as a sense of oneness with reality, because you're no longer fighting it. You're actually at one with reality. So your life flows much more easily. And yeah, so I think that's what inspired the poem.
Yeah.
There's also another personal thing was that my wife, this is a more kind of specific example, but my wife suffers from migraines. And the only way that we found that she could deal with a migraine was for me to gently guide her towards the source of the pain. If you have an extreme pain like a migraine, you want to naturally resist it and push it away. But we found that didn't work. The only way to deal with it was to gently go towards the source of the pain and to merge your being or your attention with the pain, so that you actually become the pain. And when you do that, well, this is what she finds: the pain dissolves, it spreads, it dissipates, rather than being focused in one concentrated point. And it ceases to be a pain. It becomes a soft, numb sensation that is no longer the source of discomfort or pain. So that was another, example. That's another example of the power of acceptance in dealing with pain.
Wow. Wow. So I mean, because we're motivated, we're motivated away from pain and towards pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who I heard that from, but it's always stuck with me. And I thank you for bringing up the resistance thing, because that the awareness is, the acceptance is, it feels so far away, right? It's like it's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and that can be too far away. Because if we ever get to the end of the rainbow, there isn't a pot of gold there. That's just make believe, right? So it's too far away. Whereas the being motivated away from the pain of that's involved in resistance is it feels far more tangible to me somehow.
Yeah, well, it means it's natural. I mean, all animals are motivated to move away from pain and towards comfort or pleasure. So that's one of the reasons why it is quite difficult to move into acceptance, because physiologically, it brings us well-being to move away from pain and towards pleasure or comfort. So we just repeat psychologically what we do physically, although often psychologically the reverse is the best. It's actually better to accept psychological discomfort or situations which bring us suffering, because that's what harnesses transformation.
Yeah. Wow. So I think we've got time. Can we squeeze another poem in?
Yeah, sure. This is a poem about, again, it's a similar theme. It's about the transformational power of loss, which like everybody, I've moments in my life when everything has seemed to fall away. I've seemed to lose everything. Relationships have ended. Professions have fallen by the wayside. But I've always sensed that when these moments of loss occur, there's something positive in them. They're not entirely negative. There's always a part of me which kind of smiles and thinks, something good will come of this somehow. So this is about those moments of loss. And it's simply called Loss. In every loss, there is liberation. When we're adrift in the future, chasing after goals and ambitions, loss pulls us back to the present. When illusions of success and status have inflated our self-importance, loss returns us to reality. When our minds are full of confused desires, loss disentangles us. simplifies our lives so that we have space to grow. When layers of dull contentment are suffocating our souls, loss strips us naked so that the world can touch us freshly and we can feel alive again. When there are too many attachments inside us, obscuring our true nature, loss empties out our being and reconnects us to our source. Loss breaks down our identity so that our broken fragments can fuse together again at a higher level of order. In loss, we find ourselves again.
Wow. The fragments bit, is that I've heard something from Hebrew or the Jewish faith about tikkun olam, something like that. Have you tikkun? Does that make any sense? You heard of that?
Yeah, I think that literally means the healing of the world. And every person who attains a degree of enlightenment or awakening has to share it with others to help the healing of the world and, contribute to the healing of the world.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly doing that.
Oh, hopefully. Yeah, I think there's there's a myth which is based on reality, the myth of the wanderer who's been through suffering and trauma, who returns home to share his wisdom and his experience with the others who've stayed at home, and helps them to grow. I think that's what we do in these experiences, in these transformations.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. What it is transformation through turmoil. Do you see that as the same as post-traumatic growth, or is it your take on it, or is it are they the same thing, or what's the difference?
I see it as a variety of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is quite gradual. It happens over many years, and it sometimes takes a few years to manifest itself. But transformation through turmoil often happens quite suddenly and dramatically in a single moment of transformation, and it often has much more drastic and dramatic effects than post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is very incremental, so that you can go through it without really realizing because it's so gradual. But transformation through turmoil is so drastic that people realize straight away that something major has changed inside them.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, Steve, before we bring it in?
Maybe the only thing I'd like to remind people is that, as we touched on this earlier, that you are not your thoughts or even your feelings. You are the observer, the part of you who is aware of your thoughts and feelings. And often suffering comes from identifying with our thoughts and feelings. Often that is the source of our pain. There's a famous quote from a Greek philosopher that says that it's not situations that disturb us, it's our thoughts about situations. And that applies to whatever's gone on in our past as well. It's not the past events that disturb us, it's our memory and our thoughts about the past. So you can free yourself from that by not identifying with your thoughts. And there's a freedom which comes from, the space between you and your thoughts. If you can find that space and live in that space, then you become free, at least to a large extent, you become free of suffering.
Yeah. And how would you see that fitting in with the trauma thing?
Well, I'll give you an example. I interviewed a soldier who was in the Falklands War in the 1980s, a British guy, and he was only a young lad. He was like 18 when he was thrown into the Falklands War, facing death, and he was terrified. He went through all kinds of terrible events on the battlefield, and so for years afterwards, he was in a state of trauma. He was drinking to try to divert himself from his pain. But somebody eventually, 10, 15 years later, somebody gave him a book on Buddhism. They said, this may help you. And he thought there was something in it. So he went to a Buddhist monastery. They had an open day, and he sat down to meditate for the first time, and the monk guided them through the meditation. And he said that there was 5 seconds in the meditation when he realized that he was not his thoughts, he was not his past, and that there was a part of him which was free from his trauma. And he realized that a lot of his pain came from identifying with the self which was so scarred by his trauma, and with the memories of his trauma. So he stepped back away from his thoughts and feelings, away from his pain, his memory of his experiences, and he began to meditate to try to live in that space. And eventually, he did find peace
from that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because we talk about trauma as both an event and the aftermath of the event, don't we? I think that's a bit confusing.
Yeah, well, trauma obviously has a trigger, and it obviously has some psychological and even physiological manifestations which linger afterwards. So yeah, they both can be sources of pain.
Yeah. For me, I came up with this metaphor, which I quite like. It doesn't work very well in sense of when we've been talking about alcoholism, right? Because to me, trauma seems to me to be a toxic cocktail of insecurity, fear, and shame, and anger, often, but with a cocktail glass, not its contents, right? So I'm trying to, I see that the aftermath as those feelings that are in our body, the Bessel van der Kolk thing, body keeps score. They're there. That's where they're retained, and they are triggered, but they are feelings. That's how it seems to me. I don't know. What do you make?
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Yeah, but I would say that if you can acknowledge and accept those feelings, and if you can realize that there is a part of you which is not those feelings, then you can begin to free yourself from them. So yeah, obviously you made some therapy to help you do that.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Well, I mean, I mean, everybody's capable of doing it. It's another thing I should really mention, that one thing I've found consistently in my research is that human beings are much stronger than we assume. We all have incredible reserves of resilience inside us that we're not normally aware of. It's usually only when we face critical situations that's when we become aware of those powers inside us. But so I always tell people that you're much stronger than you may be aware.
Brilliant. So, listeners, I'd encourage you to check out the poem and check out Steve's work and connect with him on social, because he's got some really powerful stuff here. And the poems are so they're so great at getting around the kind of the logical side of us. Just skirting around that left brain logic to go right to the part of us that can be impacted. So thank you very much. It's been a great hour. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Simon. I've enjoyed it too.
Yeah. Thank you, listeners. We'll speak to you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.